today's World Insight with Tian Wei, tussle of the U.S. and neighboring nations over Venezuela's president, for better or for worse.
China is a very interesting market for us.
And an exclusive with the Slovenian Prime Minister on why his country is eager to get on the Belt and Road bandwagon.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin with the political crisis in Venezuela. The United States has slapped new sanctions against a Venezuelan state oil company in an effort to push President Nicolas Maduro out of the office. Faced with mounting pressure, President Maduro has refused to hold the new elections and announced that he would beef up the nation's defense. Before we ask our panelists about their views about where the country is heading for, take a look at this.
Pressure is growing both at home and abroad on Venezuela's president. The U.S. has imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuelan state-owned oil firm PDVSA. It aims to severely curb the OPEC members' crude exports to the U.S. to pressure Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro to cede power to the opposition led by Juan Guaidó. The Trump administration recognized Mr. Guaidó last week as Venezuela's legitimate interim president.
We will continue to use all of our diplomatic and economic tools to support interim President Guaidó, the National Assembly, and the Venezuelan people's efforts to restore their democracy.
The South American country has sunk into turmoil in recent years with widespread food shortages and social unrest. Mr. Guaidó is piling the pressure on Mr. Maduro by demanding a new vote and calling for street protests. He's also offering amnesty to members of the military who defect. The embattled Venezuelan president has rejected an international demand for new elections within 8 days and said the opposition leader violated the country's constitution by declaring himself the country's leader. Mr. Maduro announced on Tuesday that he would beef up the nation's defense by expanding Venezuela's civilian armed militia. He also confirmed the closure of the embassy in the United States.
As Commander-in-Chief, I am at the forefront of this battle we are in, and we will continue to lead this battle.
Meanwhile, international pressure is rising. Besides the U.S., Canada, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, and other countries in the Americas are officially supporting Mr. Guaidó. Russia and China have been joined by Iran, South Africa, and others in defending Venezuelan sovereignty.
We oppose unilateral sanctions. History has shown that external interference and sanctions will only complicate the situation, rather than helping to resolve practical problems.
Will the tense situation in Venezuela take a turn for the better or for worse?
Well, for more on the Venezuela presidential crisis we are seeing there in that country, we are joined in Caracas by Lucas Kerner, who is a journalist and political analyst at VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Joining us in Beijing, we have Mr. Zhang Zhizhe, who is a distinguished professor and director of Center of Latin American Studies from the University of Shanghai. I want to welcome both of you. Later, we hopefully will have another guest who will join us from the United States. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Kerner, right now in Venezuela, how do you see the latest situation, particularly after the president still announced that he is willing to negotiate sitting at a negotiation table?
See, we have two extremes of this situation right now. On the one hand, we have the United States and its allies, which are pushing towards an increasingly dangerous and possibly violent regime change scenario to oust Nicolas Maduro in an incredibly polarized country where he does still have, 6.2 million people voted for him in May, and this would be a very serious situation if he was ousted militarily. Whereas, on the other hand, we have Mexico and Uruguay who are pushing for a negotiated settlement. Maybe a summit might be held in Montevideo to try to really resolve these issues and try to find a solution that does not lead to kind of a catastrophic Libya-type situation.
Mr. Kerner, if I could be just more specific about that, we heard through media interviews, for example, an interview the president had with the Russian media, talking about he is willing to sit down at the negotiation table. He refused, though, for the so-called re-election. So how should we understand the current situation there in Caracas?
I mean, the problem is that the United States and the opposition in Venezuela has taken a very extreme posture, effectively appointing a parallel president and perhaps transition government. And that's a very difficult position to negotiate with, because Nicolas Maduro claims to be the legitimate president of the country, and he was elected in the May 20th presidential elections. So the United States is going to have to, if there's going to be negotiations, the opposition is going to have to be more flexible, and in lieu of attempting to oust the government through force, as is being threatened through repeated calls to the military, there's going to have to be sitting down and dialoguing about how can we, perhaps through the mechanisms of the National Assembly, the National Assembly could be reinstated if they choose to remove 3 deputies who are under investigation for voter fraud. And the issue is that the National Assembly, the Venezuelan opposition has, since 2002, nonstop sought to overthrow this government. And in 2002, the United States, Elliot Abrams, who is now the U.S. Special Envoy to Venezuela, he supposedly gave the green light to this coup that dissolved the very constitution that the opposition claims to defend. So this is not the Trump administration and this far-right extreme of the opposition can't really be negotiated with. There are more moderate factions that recognize Nicolas Maduro but understand that while they oppose him, you have to go through him. There has to be some kind of negotiation process to move us away from the brink of civil war, which we're facing right now.
Right. Very tricky and very fluid situation over there. For now, we are also joined new by Guillermo Zuyaca, who is the head of the American Society with the Council of the Americas Venezuela Working Group. He is based in New York. Sir, welcome to our program as well. Your analysis of the latest, particularly when President Maduro, who is considered by some in his country as the president, offered to negotiate, but he refused for re-election. So what do you read about where things are going?
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show. So, I mean, the situation is clearly, as I don't know how much you've discussed, but it seems that, so, I mean, the question for you, if you can just repeat the question to make sure that I understand.
The question is, the current president offers to sit at the negotiation table, but he refuses so-called re-election. He considers himself, together with many in his country, the legitimate president. So the question is, what's next? Your reading, sir.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that, my reading is that, I don't think that Maduro is now in a position to, I mean, he is not legally the person that should be in power. As we know, the Constitution has been followed by the opposition despite all the adversary forces that they have, in the country, like censorship, repression, etc. We've the Venezuela have seen a negotiation before, one that had, the Vatican, the EU, and the Dominican Republic, and nothing happened. I think that the opposition is fully aware now that they cannot negotiate with the Maduro regime unless it involves, involves a clear, obvious way of going through a political transition. I mean, Maduro has done a negotiation before, and he just bought time. I mean, this crisis cannot wait any longer. As you know, the UN has projected 5 million migrants if the situation continues. I mean, there is no time to be wasted. As we speak, the hyperinflation only increases. The dollar and the parallel market goes up. Oil production goes down. I mean, now, of course, with the sanctions, it's even worse. So, I mean, the country is in dire need of humanitarian assistance. So I think that the time is not now for a long negotiation like the one we had before that resulted in nothing.
Okay. Obviously, we have very clear grip of the political standings of our panelists already for now. But now also go to our Chinese panelist, Mr. Jiang, Professor Jiang. You've been researching about Latin America for decades. How do you read the current episode of Venezuela regarding the big backdrop of where Venezuela has been experiencing over the past few decades?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think it is possible that both sides can sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about the future of the country. Of course, both sides need to make some kind of compromise. And I don't agree with my colleague from the U.S. saying that so it's the possibility that I would say Maduro should be blamed for the past failure. But now I will say that some people also criticize the opposition. The opposition should be blamed for this kind of failure. So I hope that now the whole situation is different. So I wish that both sides can sit down.
One of the things is very crucial right now for all our panelists, that is the economic situation in Venezuela, particularly Mr. Kerner. You are there on the ground, particularly during this round of sanctions coming from the United States against one of the key state oil companies in Venezuela, despite of the already difficult economic situation there. So what does that mean? And if things are getting worse economically, I'm saying, for average person, how is that likely to be filtered into the politics of that country, Mr. Kerner?
We really can't overstate how devastating the oil embargo that the United States just imposed on Venezuela on Tuesday, which will basically prohibit U.S. companies from selling oil to PDVSA, but also buying it. This will have, Venezuela depends on oil exports for 90% of all of its export earnings. This will have a catastrophic impact on the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. As the U.S. Congress's own Congressional Research Service acknowledged in November that harsher economic sanctions will, quote-unquote, exacerbate the difficult economic situation in the country. This is not only a callous policy to further make ordinary Venezuelans pay the price. It's collective punishment under the 14th Geneva Convention, and it's illegal under the UN Charter. This is not how this kind of basically strangling the Venezuelan economy and strangling the Venezuelan people in order to make the Maduro government fall is unacceptable and should be condemned internationally. This is not a way to ensure a solution to the Venezuela situation in this moment. And I think we should go back to the issue of dialogue that Guillermo has actually falsely stated how the dialogue took place. That in January there was a dialogue and they came to an agreement. However, it was sabotage. Elections were brought forward as was demanded by the opposition all throughout 2017. But then the opposition, with the United States, preemptively refused to recognize it. And the United States went as far as to sanction the opposition presidential candidate. So if that's not a sabotage of an electoral process in order to further the kind of violent regime change scenario we're seeing now, I don't know what is.
All right. It is no secret that with the largest crude oil reserve in the world, Venezuela relies heavily on oil exports for capital. On Monday, U.S. President Donald Trump imposed sanctions on the state-owned oil firm in Venezuela. The sanctions on PDVSA, named, blocked $7 billion in assets and could result in a loss of $11 billion in sales next year. If the U.S. buys Venezuela oil, payments will be placed in accounts. So, Venezuela can only access these accounts if the PDVSA comes under the control of Guaidó. So obviously there is a political choices being made by the United States even when it comes to oil purchase from Venezuela. But Mr. Jiang, you know better than I do, does Venezuela have other options?
Well,
economically speaking, I mean?
Yes, Venezuela can sell its oil to some kind of alternative markets like China, India, or maybe Japan or other countries. But we have to understand the oil produced by Venezuela is quite heavy, so we need to have special equipment to process this kind of oil. And the U.S. has 5 these kind of factories to process this kind of heavy oil. But for China and India, I don't believe that we have enough equipment to process this kind of heavy oil.
Got
and
it.
Also, the U.S. Sells a special chemical for this kind of process. And the U.S. says we are not going to sell this kind of special chemical for the processing this kind of heavy oil.
Right.
So that will be kind of trouble.
I see what you meant. Mr. Zuyaga, how important is Venezuela's oil for the U.S. market when it comes to the U.S. perspective? Is it important? Is it a big share, or is it only a small percentage?
Well, it used to be more important, but many years of unprecedented corruption, mismanagement have made Venezuela's oil production decline rapidly. So the U.S. has definitely looked at other sellers of oil, but the relationship is there, as your guest from your China professor was saying. The refineries in the U.S. are set up for refining Venezuela heavy oil. However, I mean, I don't think that it's going to be a big impact for the U.S. As I said, Venezuela's oil decline has been the story in the oil market for the past 5 years. Mr. Maduro hasn't been able to, reverse that trend because we're talking about one of the most corrupt countries in the world.
Mr. Zuyaga, let me ask you about another question. Recently, the media reports suggest Mr. Bolton, the national security advisor to President Trump, having on his writing pad the so-called 5,000 troops to Colombia. Of course, later the foreign ministry of Colombia denied any knowledge of anything related to even that phrase, and did not say that the U.S. has any way informed Colombia about that. Now, whether he is sophisticated enough to know that he needs to fold the important information into a folder in an important public appearance or not, but let me ask you about that. Is it a possibility for the United States to do that? If it does, what does it mean for the United States to involve in another war? Meanwhile, what does it mean for the United States as well to throw away a government that is still in power in its neighborhood? Mr. Zuyaga.
I mean, I'm not going to comment on what someone had written on his pad. I don't know if that is, it's policy. What I do know is that, this is not the U.S. This is the entire hemisphere besides, the classic allies of Bolivia and Cuba. I mean, it is telling that those countries that have received the majority of the almost 3 million migrants who have been forced to leave are the ones not recognizing President Maduro, recognizing the head of Congress, Juan Guaidó, and asking for a swift political transition into that entails, humanitarian aid and call for free and fair elections.
All right.
So I feel like we can discuss what's written on a notepad, but the reality is that, there's been a regional consensus that, Maduro was not fairly elected. He's been unable, in fact, exacerbating the crisis in the country. And the need for a political transition is just urgent.
There are different views, of course, of the international community as to what exactly does it mean, legitimate government, in this sense. I see, Mr. Kerner, you want to have your opinion here as well. Mr. Kerner.
Yeah, I think that Guillermo's once again misstating that the cause of collapse of Venezuela's oil industry, yes, mismanagement and corruption played a part, but if we look back to Francisco Rodriguez, who's the foremost expert on Venezuela's economy and advisor to the opposition, who in a report last year found that the collapse of by 1 million barrels a day of Venezuelan oil production occurred right after, in the 12 months subsequent to the imposition of U.S. financial sanctions. The United States has demolished Venezuela's oil industry with those sanctions, although of course, yes, in corruption and mismanagement have played a role.
Okay.
And this is really important because we're talking about the United States basically targeting a country, targeting its economy because it doesn't like like its government. This is not about democracy. The United States has dictatorship allies in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Brazil and Honduras likewise have very terrible democratic records. So this is about the United States wants to privatize Venezuela's oil reserves, as the National Assembly is contemplating a law to do so. John Bolton said he was speaking to oil companies that he wanted to bring into Venezuela. In fact, Guillermo works for the American Society. He coordinates corporate relations with these very companies that finances his corporate institutes, like Chevron, like Exxon. He is funded effectively by those companies.
Mr. Kerner, let's focus on Venezuela itself. We do not want to spread our discussions about all the other economies because it's a very complicated matter when it comes to other cases. But let me have Mr. Jiang over here say your words as well, Mr. Professor Jiang.
As you know, in 1965, the U.S. Sent troops to the Dominican Republic, and in 1983 to a tiny country in the Caribbean called Grenada, and then in 1989 to Panama. And these three countries were tiny, and their military powers was very weak.
So what are you trying to say,
now,
Professor Jiang? Let's focus on Venezuela.
Venezuela is very, very powerful in terms of military forces. So if the U.S. dares to send the troops to Venezuela, I don't believe that the U.S. will be very nice to see a happy end for this kind of military invasion.
Military intervention, of course, we've seen that over the past few decades, starting with Iraq and also in the other parts of the Middle East happening. And of course, the U.S. has admit to a certain extent it is learning from its lesson with the recent withdrawal of troops from the Obama administration and certainly from the Trump administration. Mr. Zuyaga, the most important question is now, from now to the next stage, what needs to happen? And how would we make sure, because we see two sides are certainly all gripping very tightly to their own stance, whether it is the opposition, whether it is the Venezuela government administration. So what is the best interest of people in the street so that they can come back somewhat to a normal life? Mr. Zuyaga, your thought.
Look, I feel that we're not going to solve the Venezuelan crisis, which is affecting, as we know, millions of people. The country needs to return to constitutional order. How to do that? I mean, the Constitution, which was, as you know, done by Chavez in 1998 after he was elected. The Constitution talks about if there is a vacancy of the executive branch. In this case, Maduro was not re-elected. He's not recognized by the National Assembly because, his elections in May were a sham. They were not observed. They were, big parties couldn't participate.
So you're saying, what is the solution here?
Now the head of
Let's just put aside the accusations aside, okay? So let's talk about the solution.
Yeah, the
what is the solution to you? Very briefly, tell us, please.
To go back to the constitutional order, to fully recognize Juan Guaidó so he can call for elections, clean up the electoral authority, and bring back the rule of law to the country, so investment can start again, so oil production can go back to where it was,
very much.
And of course combat hyperinflation.
Thank you very much. Every one of you have 30 seconds left. Mr. Kerner, 30 seconds for you as well.
I don't know how it's constitutional for Donald Trump to effectively appoint a president in Venezuela. I read Article 233 of the Constitution. It specifies very specific conditions under which there's a power vacuum. None of those are met. Because Maduro continues to exercise his constitutional functions, the opposition had a chance. They could have united behind their presidential candidate in May of 2018. They would, and if they are popular as they claim to be, they would have won. But because they did not want to negotiate with the government, they prefer not to do that, and now we are where we are.
So the solution is, to you, Mr. Kerner, very briefly, one sentence if you can, sir.
I'm sorry?
The solution.
Oh, the solution, yes. No, I mean, the solution is that there needs to be an international dialogue summit in Montevideo with the EU, with all relevant multilateral organizations participating. There needs to be an immediate ceasure of all sanctions against Venezuela so the economy, oil production can resume. The humanitarian situation will not be improved unless U.S. sanctions are ended immediately.
Okay. Professor Jiang, 30 seconds for you as well.
Yes.
Solution.
Well, solution, I think only the two sides can sit down and have a peaceful dialogue. But let's say that Maduro was elected by the people with a turnout, so with the votes rate 67%. So don't forget, he is the constitutionally, legally president of Venezuela.
All right, we are wrapping up our today's discussion. Obviously, we have very different opinions on the panel. One could tell even more what is going on the ground there in Venezuela. One thing is for sure, other parties' interference do not necessarily going to have a very satisfying result than what people in Venezuela could decide. But for now, let's leave it to Venezuela to solve the exact problem they are facing right now. Lucas Kerner and also Guillermo Zuyaga, last but certainly not least, Jiang Shixue. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the three of you. Appreciate it that you are expressing your views from your own perspective. Thank you, really appreciate it. And stay with us here on World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. An exclusive interview with Slovenian Prime Minister on why his country is eager to get on the Belt and Road Initiative. That interview right after the break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Slovenia is a southern Central Europe state at the crossroads of important European cultural and trade routes. That is why relations between China and Slovenia are important to many. Slovenia is part of the Belt and Road Initiative and, as such, has great potential for infrastructure development. The country's geostrategic position provides good prospects for investment in the sea, in the land, and air traffic infrastructure, the areas of interest for China and its partners.